Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4 have finally released, and these newest additions to the game's story have left me completely captivated, just as Chapters 1, 2, and Undertale had done so long ago. It's very difficult for a game with an episodic release schedule to capture my attention for so many years on end, yet I always continue to show up for more Deltarune. There are so many incredible creative decisions made by Toby Fox throughout the entirety of Deltarune so far, such as the characters we interact with, the variety of different gameplay mechanics presented to the player, and the game's greater connection to Undertale as its parallel story. But the specific aspect of Deltarune that's been completely standing out in my mind ever since I completed Chapter 4 is the relationship between Kris and the soul. And I don't mean Kris as an avatar. I'm specifically talking about Kris, the character, the person within the living, breathing world of Deltarune, and the soul, the player, the part of Kris that allows us to control their actions within the game's world. Throughout Deltarune's 4 chapters, we're shown a handful of incredibly impactful scenes that would suggest to us that our actions as a player and Kris's actions as a character appear to be in opposition to one another. Despite this, it's also clear to see that we both need each other in order to achieve our goals. Without Kris, we as the soul cannot interact with the game's world in a significant and meaningful way. And without the soul, Kris can just barely function, only able to move around in what seems to be an almost zombified state. The soul is literally Kris's life force, and they can't exist without it, or at least they can't act on their own without it for very long. It's this strange dynamic between Kris and the soul that creates such an interesting relationship between the player and the character that they're playing as. In most games, the avatar that we as the player inhabit has their interests directly aligned with our own. But much like Undertale, Deltarune presents us with a sort of meta-narrative that insists to the player that they are a visitor in this world that will move on with or without them. Kris is a character, their own person within this world that exists completely separate from the player's control over them. In fact, the very presence of us as the player restricts Kris's autonomy in a way that leaves them trapped within their own body, forced to act on what we believe is the right choice, regardless of whether or not it actually is. I'm completely stunned by the way that Toby Fox is shaping the narrative in this way that puts our own interests as the player at odds with the interests of our protagonist. It's such an interesting way of presenting the player with a story that makes me completely rethink what storytelling in video games can truly be when being pushed to the medium's limit, and I think it deserves a thorough discussion. By the way, there's going to be some serious spoilers for Chapters 1 through 4 of Deltarune in this video, so if you're at all interested in playing them for yourself, please go do that before watching. It's absolutely worth it. So, this relationship between Kris as a character and the soul as the player is the main thing that I want to talk about today. It was definitely something that I picked up on in the first 2 chapters of Deltarune, at least on a basic level, but the way this idea is incorporated into Chapter 3 and especially Chapter 4 has me completely fascinated. This kind of disconnect between Kris and the player that's established in the first 2 chapters has only grown to become more relevant in the most recent chapters. While many of the moments where this narrative decision is allowed to shine are small and subtle, I have no doubt that the idea will continue to be expanded upon and end up influencing gameplay in many significant ways in the future chapters. Of course, it still manages to influence gameplay in a few ways in the chapters that are currently available to us, but it's never the main focus, at least not for long. I think that the connection between Kris and their soul will end up evolving into even more of a major plot point of Deltarune than it already is, and could potentially have a huge impact on the game's ending. But as much fun as speculating about future chapters is, I want to focus on what we already know of this seemingly reluctant team-up between Kris and the player. And what better way to start than with Chapter 1? Admittedly, there aren't that many moments that focus on Kris and their connection to the player through the soul in Chapters 1 and 2, but that kinda makes sense. The idea was still mainly being alluded to and set up in both of these chapters. But there are 2 major scenes where Kris interacts with the soul in very unusual ways, those obviously being the cutscenes that play at the end of Chapters 1 and 2. But even before the first of these scenes is shown at the end of Chapter 1, there are a few times throughout the chapter that we see Kris act on their own interests, without any input from the player. Some of these examples are pretty minor, such as Kris backing away from Susie when she threatens them at the beginning of the game, but a big one that continues to stand out more and more to me as the story progresses happens after the fight with the king, when Kris rushes in to protect Susie from his attacks. In an ordinary game, these actions would immediately be overlooked, just actions that the player character takes during cutscenes, but Deltarune is far from ordinary. These moments where Kris showcases their own agency over their actions shows the player that Kris is their own person separate from our control over them. It shows us that Kris has their own personal beliefs, their own likes and dislikes completely absent from our own, and these ideas are only expanded upon in future chapters. But, of course, the biggest moment that first depicts Kris's relationship to the soul comes at the very end of Chapter 1, once Kris and Susie have returned to the light world. As Kris moves around restlessly in bed, they eventually fall out, stumbling their way to the middle of the room. It is here when they plunge their hand into their body, ripping out their soul, something Ralsei describes as the very culmination of their being, and then they throw it into a cage, all done to sever our connection and eliminate any control that we have over them. The process is obviously incredibly painful, which is plain to see from the animation, yet Kris is still willing to go through with it, all in order to reclaim their body for themselves. When I saw this for the first time way back when Chapter 1 released, I was completely shocked. The subtle moments of Kris taking their own actions thus far would never have made me expect that they would end up doing something like this. In many RPGs, the player character is often just a self-insert for the player, a blank slate for the player to take control of in order to interact with the game world. But Kris is shown to be the direct opposite of this. Although we do have direct control over Kris, they are their own character. More than that, they're their own person, someone who existed in this world long before we did. Something that I never knew until now is that during this scene where the soul is trapped in the cage, we can actually move it around a little bit. We still have control over the soul, just not in any meaningful way. Now we're the ones trapped, not Kris. After locking us away, Kris pulls out a knife and flashes a menacing smile at the camera, almost as if they're taunting us directly, completely aware of our presence. The player is now helpless to do anything, just as Kris had been for the entire chapter thus far. This scene left players with so many questions, but then it ended, and we were forced to wait. Until... Kris ate the pie. Chapter 2 opens with the comedic revelation that we had been waiting 3 years for, but its lighthearted nature doesn't take away from the impact that Chapter 1's ending had. There was very clearly something more going on here, and the rest of Chapter 2 definitively proves that. While there are a handful of moments sprinkled throughout Chapter 2 that focus on Kris and their relationship with the soul, the most interesting ones are actually split up between the chapter's 2 distinct routes that we can choose to play through. Firstly, I'll talk about what happens if the player chooses the pacifist route, which is likely the option that most people will go with on their first playthrough. In the latter half of the pacifist route, once the player has made their way to Queen's Mansion, they're able to unlock a hidden area that houses the chapter's secret boss, Spamton Neo. Spamton pops up earlier in the chapter and says some pretty weird shit, but it's not until his secret boss fight that the ramblings go from seemingly incoherent to relevant and unsettling. To give a short summary, Spamton is a puppet, and he's been using Kris to break free from his strings and attain true control. Sound familiar? Despite all that Spamton was able to achieve through his manipulation of Kris, he's still confined to his now very literal strings. Now he believes that the only path to true freedom is through Kris's soul. The parallels drawn between Kris and Spamton in the lead up to the battle are subtly communicated to the player in very interesting ways, but the most obvious of them is demonstrated throughout the fight itself. In order to build up mercy and eventually spare Spamton to win the battle, Kris, Susie, and Rousey have to snap the strings puppeteering Spamton. Once the strings have finally been cut, Spamton realizes the error of his ways, considers Kris a true friend, and excitedly awaits his ascension to freedom. And with the snap of one final string, he's returned to the ground. Even with all that's happened up to this point, Spamton can't escape the fact that he's just a puppet. Without strings to control it, a puppet just kinda exists. It just sits there, unable to move or take any actions at all. While Spamton had his own will, he lacked the means to act on it in any meaningful way, and this deeply resonates with Kris. In the moments where we have direct control over Kris, which is for the vast majority of the game, Kris is in the exact same position that Spamton was in. They're just a puppet, and we're the ones pulling the strings. We puppeteer Kris throughout the events of chapters 1 and 2, choosing their actions and making decisions for them in their own world, completely uncaring what their own personal thoughts might be on the matter. So it's no surprise that the events surrounding this fight rattled Kris to their core. After the battle, as the party ascends the stairs back up to Queen's Mansion, they begin to discuss how strange that whole situation just was. When Susie asks Kris if they're alright after that, the player once again has the choice of how Kris should respond. No matter the choice, it's clear to see that Kris is affected by the battle, but selecting no always stuck out to me. If you select no, Kris will just start to yell. This is such an important moment of Kris's characterization for me. Their reaction to everything that just happened to them is so telling of Kris's unbreakable connection to the player controlling them, but it also raises so many questions at the same time. The main one for me at this point is, what exactly will happen to Kris in the true absence of the player? We've seen that they're able to survive without the soul for short periods of time, but what if they were to remove it completely? Or if we were to simply stop playing and disappear? Would Kris regain full control over their body, or would they lose the ability to do anything? Would they become like Spamton? But this is only half the story of Chapter 2. While the pacifist route is the straightforward option for the player, we can also choose to go down another, much darker path. This other path is known as the Weird Route, or to use its much cooler name, the Snowgrave Route. The Snowgrave Route doesn't really have any super obvious moments unique to it that specifically explores the soul's control over Kris, but it's more subtly communicated to us that the entire route itself is actually all about this idea of control over another. Though in this case, it's not about control of Kris, but control over Noelle. And even then, it's important to make the additional distinction that this isn't about Kris having control over Noelle, but it's us. The Snowgrave Route is an incredibly specific path that the player must intentionally choose to proceed down. The route officially begins when Noelle joins the party and gains the ability to act under Kris's command in battle. Though this time, instead of acting to spare the enemies, or even defeating them outright, we must command Noelle to cast Ice Shock on every single enemy we encounter. As the route progresses, Noelle appears to lose all agency, saying stuff along the lines of "Kris knows best" and "Kris is helping me," to ignore the reality of what Kris is actually making her do. Only, it isn't Kris who's making her do any of this. It's us. We're manipulating Kris to manipulate Noelle into freezing all these enemies. It's a different kind of messed up than the No Mercy route in Undertale, because here in Deltarune, we're not doing this on our own. We're forcing Noelle into this. She wouldn't want to do this on her own. And this idea of forcing Noelle down this path rather than having Kris do it themselves is further explored in Chapter 4's Snowgrave dialogue. There's a couple other things that the player has to do to firmly lock in progression down the Snowgrave route, like all the Proceed stuff and equipping Noelle with the Thorn Ring, but that's pretty much the gist of it. But I think the most important part of the Snowgrave route happens during the boss fight against the goat, Birdly. In the battle against Burgley, Noelle now has the option to use a new spell called Snowgrave. At first, she insists that she doesn't know the spell, and that she can't cast it, but if you keep pushing her to cast it anyway, she'll unleash her full magical power on Burgley, turning him into frozen chicken tenders. This is also one of the few scenes throughout the entire Snowgrave route where she actually tries to push back against what Kris is telling her. While she still ends up going through with what she's told to do, she takes a much firmer stance than she had with any of the other issues that she'd been pressed on. And after this, she just leaves. While Toby Fox has previously stated that Deltarune is only going to have one ending, I have no doubt that the Snowgrave route is going to continue to evolve into something incredibly powerful. While it may not seem like the main focus of the route, the actions that we take throughout Snowgrave expands the influence that the soul has over the world of Deltarune. We aren't just enacting our will onto and throughout Kris, but now our reach is expanded to include Noelle as well. And Noelle appears to be even more powerful than Kris. In most games, we're usually working together with these characters we control in order to defeat some ultimate evil. But in a world like Deltarune's, in the hands of a player with malicious intent, couldn't we be that ultimate evil that the characters need to defeat? Now, while I did really enjoy Chapter 3 a lot, I initially thought that it was one of the sillier chapters of the bunch. But if you take the time to really explore the secrets that this chapter has to offer, you'll find a lot of significant story content that's related to our control over Kris. The majority of these moments take place in the chapter's secret S-Rank room. Gaining entry to the S-Rank room allows you to play the original game that Tenna based his own game on. The content within the original game seems to have a lot to do with the Snowgrave route, as well as Kris's own personal thoughts about the events unfolding around them. The first time you play the game, it's only a little different than Tenna's version that you already played through, and it doesn't really get weird until the end. Although, instead of Tenna's usual quizzes and minigames, here you have to hit familiar-looking monsters with your sword in the overworld in order to progress and level up. Once you defeat every monster and reach the max level, you gain the ability to destroy trees, and are able to sort of clip out of bounds of the game until you find a chest. When opening the chest, text slowly spreads across the screen, reading, "You got the ice key," while playing an eerie jingle. And then the game automatically shuts off, gating your progress until you beat Tenna's next game show round. Also, this is definitely a side tangent, and I might be reaching here, but I can't help but wonder if the choice to clearly model the game off the original Legend of Zelda is more intentional than it might initially seem. It has often been stated by developers at Nintendo that Link was created as an avatar to be the literal link between the player and the game world. While Link has evolved to have much more of his own characterization and personality through many iterations, this was at least the original intention for his character. So it can be very telling that we end up playing a game very reminiscent of Link's first adventure inside of a game where the character we control is quite literally our link into their world, whether they want us there or not. I don't know, like I said, I could totally be reaching with this entire line of thought, but I thought it was a kind of cool connection I came up with and thought it might be worth sharing. But getting back on track, I just love the whole vibe that the S-Rank room secrets have. It reminds me of times when you would be sharing secrets about games with your friends before the internet made it easy to find everything. It's eerie and sinister, like it isn't even really supposed to be in the game at all. The original game has a familiar setting, but it's just different enough to be slightly off-putting. The lack of music before you obtain the sword is such a great touch too. All you can hear are the sounds of waves and wind. Playing a game inside of a game is a cool enough concept on its own, but the additional context that it provides for Kris as a character makes it even better. Forcing Kris to play as a mini version of themselves as they fight against monsters that look vaguely similar to some of their friends and family is an even more sinister form of puppetry, and it's wild to watch the narrative surrounding Kris unfold like this in such a unique way. Even before you get your next chance to enter the S-Rank room, the circumstances surrounding it are already a lot stranger the second time around. If you go far enough out of bounds in Tenna's version of the game, he'll prevent you from seeing what lies beyond this icy shore. His suspicious behavior has been steadily growing up until this point, and it's becoming increasingly clear that he's been hiding something. Once you're able to enter the S-Rank room properly, the original game becomes a lot darker in tone. Again, you're initially met with the discomforting quiet of the island's surroundings, but things really start to pick up once you get to the place that Tenna didn't want you to see. Upon reaching the same icy shores that were left over from this original game, you'll find a door with an image of the Deltarune inscribed on it. You're able to open this door with the ice key that you previously obtained. Once inside, the atmosphere becomes much more tense, and you're met with more monsters that you need to defeat in order to continue leveling up. Eventually, you'll encounter a creature that's referred to as the White Cloak, a pretty clear stand-in for Noelle. Attacking the figure doesn't really do anything. It gets pushed around and definitely takes damage, but it can never be defeated. But if you leave the room, it'll follow you. This White Cloak character also casts ice magic at your request. Every time you attack, the Ice Mage will throw out a blast of ice in the direction that you're facing, dealing damage to other monsters, but also to itself. You use the White Cloak to defeat monsters, solve puzzles, and even freeze a very Chudley-like obstacle that could be found near the beginning of the dungeon. This entire sequence is a complete reflection of the Snowgrave route. Whether you played the route for yourself or not, this bit of gameplay will always be available for you to experience in the S-Rank room. Our connection to Kris, and Kris's own connection to Noelle, will continue to shape the future of this world, with or without the player experiencing Snowgrave for themselves. After using the white cloak to guide you to the deepest part of the labyrinth, you come across another door marked by the Deltarune. As you approach the door, the text reads, "The door is locked. The ice key was used up. She was used up." The door opens. You step further into the darkness. A formless voice speaks to you. "Well done. You found my secret hiding place. But there's nothing here. Is there?" You press on further through the dark. A glimmering light appears. You reach out and touch it. You got the shelter key. The voice returns. "Oh, you found that too. Perfect. Just perfect. Thanks for all your hard work, Kris. You were used up." The game shuts off, and Kris looks away from the screen, perhaps back at us. I love this whole part so much. It seems to me like it's foreshadowing what could end up happening to Kris and Noelle as long as the player continues to have control over them. The idea of us only being able to progress through somehow using up these characters in order to see the journey through to its end brings into question if what we're doing is even right, no matter what route we choose to play. We don't yet know what Kris's purpose is when they act on their own without the soul. The events of both chapters 3 and 4 seemingly show us that Kris is working with the Knight in some way, but we don't know why. Who's to say that our way of interacting with the world of Deltarune isn't the wrong way? Kris might be trying to undo whatever damage we might be unknowingly causing this world through our control of them. This is skipping ahead a little bit, but I've seen a lot of talk about the angel from Deltarune's prophecy that we get to see in chapter 4. It seems like there are a lot of parallels being drawn between the angel and Noelle, like her having played an angel in an old school play and having kept the wings. This seems to suggest that Noelle would take on the role of the angel, but the prophecy talks specifically about banishing the angel, and banishing Noelle doesn't really make sense, at least not now. But I've seen some theories suggesting that the angel might actually be the player, which is a really interesting line of thinking. Banishing the player would absolutely make sense, in order to give Kris agency over their own life once again. We already know that when Ralsei asks Kris to close their eyes and imagine what Susie is doing in certain situations, Kris and Ralsei are most likely using this opportunity to talk without the player being able to observe them. They might be planning out how they would banish the player from Kris's body. Banishing us from being able to interact with Deltarune's world could be the only real way to save it, not whatever it is that we've been doing so far. Either way, I think it's clear to see that Kris is scared at the thought of being used up by the player, used to fulfill whatever we deem their purpose to be, and then cast aside. These rare moments where Kris openly expresses their emotions can give us a lot of insight to them as a character. But for as significant as the second visit to the S-Rank room is, the third and final one might be even more so. The last time we're able to enter the S-Rank room, everything is a lot more somber than before. Tenna's crash out has caused everyone to leave the green room, and now the only one left is Ram. I haven't talked about Ram at all up until now, but he has a pretty significant role throughout chapter 3, even as a side character. Ram is the one who's been giving Kris access to the original game. In the few conversations that you have with him in the S-Rank room, he reveals that he's keeping a fair amount of secrets from Tenna, all in order to provide Kris with one thing: freedom. I think the idea of Kris somehow achieving freedom through playing the original game is something that's definitely worth keeping in mind. Unfortunately, when you're ready to play the game for the third time, Ram is partially petrified, as he's not originally from this dark world. But he did manage to set the game up for Kris one last time, and playing through it exposes the final secrets that chapter 3 has to offer. The last stage of the original game has us exploring what appears to be a recreation of Cyber City from chapter 2. Strangely enough, this time the game spawns Kris's avatar in with Susie and Ralsei following behind them as well, even though Kris had been alone in the last 2 secret levels. You have to wander around this empty and silent level as usual until you once again find the sword, but once you obtain the sword, there's nowhere to go. Or so it seems. Remember how you gain experience and progress through the last 2 secret levels? By defeating monsters. But there are no monsters in this level, right? When you use the sword on Susie and Ralsei's avatars, Kris again looks away from the screen, maybe shielding their eyes from seeing their avatar do something that they would never do themselves, or maybe looking back at us in disbelief. Using the strength obtained from defeating Susie and Ralsei, we're able to cut through the ropes that were blocking our path, and eventually make our way into a manhole. Upon entering, we're presented with another dungeon area to go through. One of the more important rooms that can be found in this dungeon houses a puzzle and a little shadow creature. The creature mimics Kris's movements, and you use that in order to solve the puzzle, but then something weird happens. You can't move Kris anymore, until you realize that now you're controlling the creature instead. Moving this creature over to Kris causes them to react by slashing their sword at it and defeating it, before you can even resume control over Kris. I think this definitely has to be some sort of symbolism for our control over Kris as a whole. We've been controlling Kris this whole time, almost as if we're trying to replace them entirely. But when this shadow creature goes to make a move at Kris, supposedly in order to replace them, Kris attacks. Kris is actively fighting back against our control now, in these moments that we can see for sure, and likely in many that we haven't seen yet as well. After a particularly tragic encounter with Tenna, we're able to make our way out of the dungeon and proceed down a familiar looking path. You'll eventually realize where you are as the town's shelter comes into view, and here's where one of my favorite little details in the entire game is shown. As you continue to walk towards the shelter, Kris's movement speed will begin to slow, and they eventually start pushing up on the controller to move in the opposite direction, trying to prevent you from entering. I think this is so cool, because it's like the only instance so far of Kris actively fighting back against our control over them as we're moving around in actual gameplay. I can't wait to see what other ways Kris will try to fight against our control in future chapters. It's clear now that there's something in the shelter that Kris doesn't want the player to see, and the events that take place during the end of Chapter 3 and in Chapter 4 continue to allude to that fact. Once you're finally able to make your way into the shelter, we have to fight some other shadowy monster, and it has some very interesting dialogue lines, especially if you play on a file that did the Snowgrave route in Chapter 2. The monster will always say that some part of Kris is enjoying playing around like this and collecting the shadow crystals, but if you're on a Snowgrave playthrough, they'll say that it's the same part of Kris that enjoyed what happened yesterday, knowing that they can make an excuse that it wasn't really them taking those actions. All the S-rank sections definitely seem to have some sort of connection to what happens in the Snowgrave route, exemplified by some of the clearer references to the route, as well as the appearance of the Snowgrave jingle at certain points within the S-rank room. But the overt confirmation that there are other entities in the Deltarune world that know Kris is under our control was kinda wild to hear, especially combined with its reference to Snowgrave. Once you're finally able to beat this fight, you gain access to the Shadow Mantle armor piece, but it's in a chest that's too high for Kris's avatar to reach. The actual way to solve this problem is such an awesome little bit of reality-bending gameplay. If you continue moving to the right, the mini Kris is able to leave the screen that the game is being played on and just walk right out into the actual Deltarune world, and the real Kris reacts appropriately. Somehow, as Kris's soul, we were able to bring this fake version of Kris into their real world, which is probably pretty terrifying for the real Kris. Their reactions to whatever actions you take as mini Kris here are also really telling us to some of Kris's true motivations and internal thoughts. If you choose to attack Kris, they'll back up and fall over, which makes sense, but if you choose to just walk away, something that I think is even more revealing ends up happening. If you make the avatar leave the room, Susie will come in and start speaking with Kris, but you can actually bring the avatar back in. If you choose to then try and attack Susie, Kris will pull her away to save her from you. This moment was also really impactful for me, because up until this part, I had always kind of wondered if maybe Kris didn't actually like Susie and Rouse, and was just forced to interact with them because of the player's control. I kinda believed in the evil Kris theories for a while there, but now I think it's definitely something deeper than just the difference between good and bad. This moment, as well as Kris's reactions to making mini Kris attack Susie and Rouse's avatars earlier, really solidified for me that Kris definitely does care about their friends, and they want to protect them. Though a lot of stuff in both chapters 3 and 4 pretty definitively proves that Kris is working with the Knight in some capacity, I think it's probably to achieve some kind of greater good. Maybe getting rid of the player's control really is the best outcome for this world. But now it's finally time to move on to my favorite chapter of them all, Chapter 4. So there's one part in particular in Chapter 4 that was my entire inspiration to make this video in the first place, and it takes place when Kris and Susie go to explore Noelle's house. The entire chapter is incredible overall, but the whole section in Noelle's house just completely blew me away. When I mentioned at the beginning of the video how Deltarune makes me rethink what's possible with storytelling through video games, this is what I was talking about. When Kris and Susie are searching for clues about the shelter in Noelle's house, you can eventually make your way into Dessa's room. There are a lot of her old belongings in there that have a bunch of interesting text indicating what kind of person she might have been before she disappeared, but the most important of these items is her old guitar. When you interact with the guitar, you'll find the shelter code hidden inside it. But before you can finish reading the last number, Kris rips out the soul, freeing themselves from our control and preventing us from seeing the completed code. Although Kris slightly fought back against our control in the final section of the S-rank room, this is the first time that they've gone to such great lengths to prevent us from acting through them in an actual gameplay section. Obviously, Kris doesn't want us seeing this code and gaining access to the shelter. This is definitive proof that our own actions and interests as the player are directly at odds with those of the protagonist, the character living within this world that we're actively controlling. Kris will then bring the soul to the closet, throwing us in an empty gift box and locking the door. Luckily, we're able to move through the vents as the soul, traveling to different areas of Noelle's house and gaining the opportunity to eavesdrop on a lot of very significant conversations. The most relevant of these conversations for the purposes of this video is definitely the phone call between Kris and this mysterious voice, presumably belonging to the Knight. We can only really hear fragments of the voice over the phone, but they allude to Kris's plans, their desire to keep Susie from finding the code in the guitar, and Kris's necessity for the soul. It seems as though Kris can't accomplish their goals without the help of the soul, creating a sort of uneasy alliance between themselves and the player. Something in the Dark World can't be done without the soul being present. Though Kris's need for the soul in order for their survival is also further implied by the fact that Kris just slumps over after the phone call ends. Listening to this conversation seems to imply that Kris has sinister motives of some kind, but there's another conversation that we can observe that shows off the softer, more caring side of Kris. However, this conversation can only be seen by playing on a Snowgrave file. Since I talked so much about the Snowgrave route already when discussing Chapter 2, it would be wrong not to bring this Chapter 4 Snowgrave conversation up. Plus, I think it has a lot to do with the themes of control that are so central to the overall narrative of Deltarune. If you did everything related to Snowgrave correctly in Chapter 2, Noelle will ask to speak with Kris alone after they've ripped out the soul. If you travel to the vents in Noelle's room, you can listen in and influence the outcome of this conversation. Noelle reveals to us that after the events of Chapter 2's Snowgrave route, Kris went to comfort her and tell her that everything that happened in Snowgrave was just a prank. Noelle distinctly talks about how it was Kris speaking to her, not the player. Her line stating how she felt like Kris was finally back and acting like themselves again was almost kinda sad to read. We're taking control of Kris, and therefore preventing them from interacting with their friends and family in ways that they usually would. That prevents Kris from truly connecting with the people in their life, and also deprives their loved ones from being with the real Kris. It's just us. But this added context to what happened after the events of Chapter 2 and the Snowgrave route definitively proves to us that Kris absolutely cares for their friends and family, and just wants to protect them. I definitely read too far into the dialogue about Kris pranking Noelle in the past, and thought that maybe it meant that Kris had some sort of problem with her, but this finally puts that to rest for me. Kris wants to protect Noelle, but if we want to continue the Snowgrave route, we can't let that happen. Noelle then asks to speak to Kris about something else, and this is where we can begin to influence the conversation, leading to a truly insane outcome. If we select Proceed when Noelle asks if she can continue talking, and then re-enter Kris's body, Noelle will lead into another shocking revelation. Kris made sure to tell Noelle not to bring this up again, or else someone might overhear them. Or else we might overhear them. Even with no one else in the room, Kris isn't even safe to have a conversation, not as long as we're there. Kris even covers Noelle's mouth to prevent her from speaking here, but it doesn't work. She removes Kris's hand, saying that it's okay because it's just the two of them. After all, who could overhear? Me. The room goes dark. The wind starts to blow. Kris has no control. Noelle hears the voice from her dream, hears our voice. And since we have the ability to hear her thoughts, we answer them. It wasn't a dream. I heard. It's not a coincidence. It happened. It snowed. Noelle becomes stronger. Equip. We force Kris to pull out the thorn ring, and equip it on Noelle's finger as she's paralyzed with fear. This causes something weird to happen. It appears as if we've somehow injected part of our own soul into Noelle in this scene, which would later allow us to assume direct control over her in the same way we control Kris. I think the idea of directly controlling Noelle somewhere down the line in the Snowgrave route makes a lot of sense, so that could definitely be the case. After Kris eventually regains control of their body, they bring the soul to the bathroom, throw it in a trash can, and completely tear it apart for what we've done. Noelle specifically mentioned that Kris wanted to protect her, and yet we deliberately chose to undo everything that Kris had done in order to keep her safe. Through choosing intentional and unnecessary cruelty, we may have irreparably corrupted Noelle. The idea that we as players also don't yet know where the Snowgrave route leads and are acting simply out of morbid curiosity also adds another level of insanity to how messed up this route already is. We have no idea what might happen next, and yet we're still choosing the darker path. Noelle obviously isn't real to us, she's just a video game character, but she's real to Kris. And if they didn't already before, it's definite now. Kris hates us. And this is where it really hit me. We are not Kris. Although I knew it on some level already, Kris and the player are not the same. Noelle, Susie, and Rousey aren't our friends, they're Kris's. We're not a true part of Deltarune's world. We're not supposed to be there. It seems as though our motivations are completely different from Kris's. Kris is their own person living in this world, and we have no real idea what it is they're trying to accomplish yet. All we do is use our control over them to impose our will onto this world, with no idea if our choices are truly the correct ones. Kris is going to increasingly far lengths in order to prevent us from meddling in their affairs, and I'm excited to see where things go as this rivalry between Kris and the player escalates further in future chapters. Even though it's only halfway done, Deltarune is already an incredible game. The story that's being played out before us as time moves on is so immensely captivating, and the discussions and theories that come with that are so much fun to engage with. The release of chapters 3 and 4 have sparked a lot of Deltarune discussions between me and my friends, and that's one of the things I love most about the game. There's such an air of mystery around everything that happens in it, so you can't help but come to your own conclusions about what might be going on. And sharing those thoughts with others that are just as invested in the story of the game as you are is a great way to pass the time until future chapters release. While I do absolutely love Deltarune for all that it is, the interactions between the player and Kris as a character, not just as a conduit into the game's world, is what left me the most impressed after having played through chapters 3 and 4. Kris's relationship to the soul brings to mind so many additional questions, even after having thought about it for this long. Like, did Kris always have a soul, or was it artificially placed into them somehow? And if they did always have the soul, was it always tied to the player's control over them? What did Kris do before we had control over them? Can they even survive without the soul? Without us? I have no idea, and I think even attempting to answer one of these questions would take far too long, so perhaps that's best saved for another time. Whatever the case may be, one thing is certain. Kris wants their freedom. With the introduction of the true prophecy in Chapter 4, Kris is referred to as the Cage. The Cage, with human soul and parts, is trapping us by keeping the soul contained to their own body. But at the same time, Kris is trapped within their own body as well, forced to take actions that aren't truly their own. It almost has an element of cosmic horror tied to it in a way. The connection born of necessity between the player and Kris will no doubt continue to have a drastic influence over Deltarune's overall story. I can't wait to see what Kris chooses to do next, and I suspect that it might once again be something that directly opposes what we're trying to accomplish as the player. The distinction between our actions and Kris's actions is definitely an important one to keep in mind, because we're simply not them. Kris is Kris, and it's becoming increasingly obvious that we are not welcome. Kris knows we're here, and they hate us for it.